today we're talking about data science in production, but what does that actually mean to be in production?
It's in the eyes of the beholder at the end of the day. Production is a spectrum. It can mean many different things to different individuals in the same organization. Depending on the maturity of your project, your definition of production could be quite different. I remember back at Netflix, we had sort of like, of course, the Netflix recommendation system is perhaps one of the most famous machine learning system that's out there. And you can imagine, I think everybody would agree that the definition of shipping a model to production means that you're able to run an A/B test against that model, against sort of like, live user traffic. And that sort of like is a good definition of production. But there were a lot of other data-informed decisions that the organization was also making. And I'm pretty sure that's the same thing across many other companies too, where the output of the model informs a business strategy. So in that way, even an offline analysis of a model where you end up generating a Google Doc or end up writing a memo for consumption by, let's say, the business team can go a long way. I'm pretty sure a lot of companies in the consumer space, for example, Spotify, I believe, recently raised their prices or is about to raise prices. And there would have been a lot of statistical analysis and very likely machine learning that might have also gone in terms of figuring out what kind of pricing strategy or pricing changes across geographies would work well. And that's yet another example of putting models into production where no microservices involved, no high scale, low latency inferencing is involved, but still is as critical to the business as any other machine learning use case.
Okay, yeah. So it's not just about like putting some data science in a consumer facing app. It could just be, oh, well, this is going to be a change prices or something like that. I like that. All right. So can you talk me through what are the steps that need to happen to go from this is an internal project to this is going to be something customer facing or otherwise in production?
I mean, I think at the end of the day, the first question always is that, is this model even worthy of being in production, right? I think there's sort of like a popular statistic. I don't even know if it is accurate that says that, there's like X number of models never make their way into production and that X number is obscenely high. There may well be some truth to it, but I think one thing that sort of like, is most important to understand is that in data science, there is an expectation that many of your models will never make their way into production because you run some tests, you figure out that, yes, this model isn't really sort of like worthy of promoting to production or sort of like, continuing any further development on top of it. And that's okay. That's the nature of data science. And what's most important is that are you able to move from one model to the next version of the same model very quickly and effectively or not? So that's basically my viewpoint when it comes to figuring out sort of like, how to promote a model or what does sort of like, production actually sort of like mean. And now to your original question of sort of like, what are the different levels that are involved? So if you think about the life cycle of a machine learning project, so that sort of like, starts out with data, you have certain hypotheses, you look at the data, you train a bunch of models, and then you figure out that, okay, in what capacity would you want to consume these models? And if it's a consumer setting where you can run decently powered A/B tests, then quite often that sort of like, is a good next step. But that may or may not be feasible at times. There are times when, you just cannot run A/B tests. You're not in a situation to do that. And then you can be a little bit more creative in terms of running quasi tests. But when that's also not feasible, then we usually see sort of like, people invest a lot more heavily around explainability of their outcomes. So, for example, one of the more popular machine learning application at Netflix is this suite of models called Crystal Ball that allows Netflix to predict the valuation, the dollar valuation of any piece of content so that they can be a lot more disciplined in terms of how they construct their portfolio. And creating a counterfactual in that particular scenario is going to be very tricky as well as running an A/B test can be quite difficult as well. And in those scenarios, then you sort of rely on the explainability of the outcomes of your model, and then you rely on sort of like your business judgment at the end of the day, and that sort of is yet another mechanism of figuring out whether the model is worthy of being deployed or not.
Okay, so really a lot of it's about just making sure that you have something that's going to add value before you put it in a place where customers are going to see it. Okay. So before we get into the details of how you go about doing all this, I'd like to hear some success stories. So have you come across any cases where companies have sort of invested in putting their data code into production and then they've seen some sort of benefit?
Yeah. I think, Netflix has always been sort of like the poster child for machine learning adoption. And this was, like maybe a decade ago or something when they first spoke publicly about the impact of recommendation system on their bottom line. And even at that point, I think there was a paper at one of the more prominent machine learning conferences where basically we came to the conclusion that the Netflix recommendation system was helpful to the tune of more than $1 billion to the company's top line. And that's really impactful. And now basically, if we sort of move forward a decade later, where exactly sort of like the biggest impact has been made have been sort of like the long tail of machine learning applications. A lot of organizations, of course, if you're, let's say, net new to machine learning, then you end up focusing on your tentpole use cases. So, for example, for Netflix, it would be their recommendation systems. For Facebook or Google, it would be their advertising or search systems. And that's great. That's where you'll derive sort of the largest value. But as you sort of mature up, then there are a lot of internal business processes, a lot of other consumer interfaces that can be made a lot better with machine learning. And the aggregate effect of that usually ends up surpassing the tentpole use case. And that is something that we have seen quite often, not only at Netflix, but of course, we have a popular open source project called Metaflow, which sort of helps organizations build machine learning models and deploy that in production as well. So we've been able to sort of see the impact across other companies too. So there are companies like 23andMe who use machine learning as well as data science to predict traits and outcomes using genetic data. And that has been quite remarkable in terms of just doing first-rate medical research. We have companies in the similar space like Medtronics who have been focused on surgical AI, and that's yet another area. If you just look at drug discovery or automated surgeries, the amount of value that can be generated and the actual real-world impact to people's lives is really great. Another example that I came across during the pandemic was this company called Zipline. They build automated drones that are responsible for bulk of drug supplies, including COVID vaccines in sub-Saharan Africa. And their drones are modeled they are powered through machine learning algorithms as well. And at the end of the day, of course, we look at sort of the big tech sector and how sort of interesting consumer applications are made. That sort of is always getting the limelight. But when you look at sort of these real world impact that is actually really sort of shaping people's day to day, I think that's been sort of a lot more rewarding and enriching to just see sort of from the sidelines at times.